Picture a city built entirely on water, 118 small islands, lashed together by 400 bridges, floating in a lagoon at the top of the Adriatic Sea. Now fill it with the smell of 100,000 people, living and dying in close quarters, their waste draining directly into the canals that also carry their food and their merchants and their letters and their prayers. Add the smell of low tide in August, when the lagoon breathes out everything it has been holding. Add the particular sweetness of rotting flesh that starts in the armpits and spreads outward. Add the smoke of bonfires burning in the streets, herbs and sulfur and old rags, because someone decided that the right way to stop a plague is to change the smell of the air, as if death can be confused by perfume. That's Venice, the Serenissima, the most serene republic, a place where you could walk across water in the morning and stand inside a church so beautiful it makes you forget your own name by afternoon. A city of merchants who traded with the whole known world and dragged home silk and spices and glass and slaves and, in the summer of 1576, something they didn't mean to bring back at all. We're going back there tonight, not as tourists staring at the paintings, not as pilgrims kissing the stones of San Marco. We're living it. One illness, one island, one person. Everything they would have felt, smelled, heard, and survived, or tried to survive. So I make these history stories, and I genuinely don't know if you people are falling asleep to them or just lying in the dark wanting to hear about medieval plague medicine in graphic detail. Both are entirely valid. Either way, get comfortable. Get very comfortable. Because this one starts with you already flat on your back, and it only gets more horizontal from there. Here we go. Your name is Giacomo Beltrame. You're 23 years old. You arrived in Venice 14 months ago from a village outside Treviso, carrying a letter of introduction from your uncle's cousin to a man who turned out to be dead. A bundle containing 2 shirts, a pair of boots that pinched your left foot, and the particular kind of desperate optimism that only a young man from the countryside can sustain in the face of overwhelming evidence against it. Venice ate your optimism in about 3 weeks. The city wasn't what you expected. Nothing is ever what the stories say. The stories talk about the palaces, the gold, the carnival, the glass blown in Murano that catches light like solid water. The stories don't mention the parts you actually inhabit, which are the parts between the palaces, the cramped alleys and the damp courtyards, and the bridges so narrow you have to turn sideways to pass someone coming the other way. You found work as a facchino, a porter. You carried things. That's it. That's the job. Someone has a crate that needs to go from the Rialto to somewhere else in the city. You put the crate on your back and you walk it there. You lift bales of wool off barges at the docks and stack them in warehouses. You carry casks of wine up narrow stairways in the dark. You haul sacks of grain from the boats in the Canal Grande to the market stalls at the Rialto, 3 at a time if you can manage it, because 3 is faster and faster means more trips, and more trips means more soldi at the end of the day. Your back knows every bridge in Venice, every step, every lip of stone where the bridge begins and the cala ends. Your legs know the difference between a fondamenta, the wide walkway alongside a canal, and a sottoportego, the low-covered passage that cuts through the ground floor of a building where you have to duck or lose your forehead. You learn to navigate this city the way you learned everything in Venice, by getting it wrong first, by stepping into what you thought was a shallow puddle and finding yourself shin-deep in canal water, by turning left when you should have turned right, and ending up at a dead end that dropped straight into the dark water below. But you learned. And then August came. August in Venice is a particular kind of hell that the rest of Europe doesn't fully understand. The lagoon traps the heat. The canals, which are not the romantic sparkling waterways described by people who visit in April, become sluggish and brown. The smell of them rises into every alley, every window, into your sleep. You breathe canal in Venice in August. It gets into your clothes and your hair and the back of your throat, and it stays there. And this August of 1576, it was worse. Because this August Venice was dying, not metaphorically, not the slow economic dying that the merchants talked about, the old men lamenting that the trade routes had shifted and the Portuguese had found their own way to the east and Venice wasn't what it used to be. That was happening too. But that wasn't what was killing people in the streets. What was killing people in the streets was the plague, pestilenza, the word you heard everywhere that summer, whispered in doorways, shouted across canals, the word that made men cross themselves and women pull their children inside, the word that had started in Cyprus and moved west through the trade routes, hitching a ride on the same ships that brought the spices and the silk, invisible and patient, waiting for Venice. You knew it was happening. Everybody knew. The bells had been ringing for weeks. Not the ordinary bells that mark the hours, but the longer, flatter toll that means someone is dead. The death knell. Bell after bell after bell. By the end of July, you stopped being able to count them. You thought you were careful. You stayed away from the parishes where the death rate was highest. You washed your hands in the canal water, which is not actually a good idea, but at least felt like doing something. You wore the herb bundle around your neck that the old women at the market swore would keep the plague away. Dried rosemary and rue and a small piece of cloth that had been blessed by a priest who was probably dead by the time you bought it. None of it mattered. On the 3rd day of August, you woke up with a headache. By evening, you had a fever that made the room tilt sideways. By the following morning, you had the swelling. It started in your right armpit. A hardness like a fist forming beneath the skin, hot to the touch in a way that skin should not be hot. When you pressed it experimentally with your fingers, the pain was so sudden and bright that you had to bite your knuckle to keep from screaming. You pressed it again anyway because you needed to be sure. It was a bubo. You had heard the word before. Bubo. It sounded almost gentle, almost round and harmless, nothing like what it actually meant. What it actually meant was, you had the plague. What it actually meant was, without intervention, you would probably be dead in 3 to 5 days. You lay in your small room above the workshop of a candle maker on the Calle della Misericordia, sharing it with 2 other porters, both of whom were already gone when you woke, having heard you moving in the night and drawn their own conclusions. And you tried to think clearly. It was hard to think clearly. The fever made thinking feel like trying to read through water. You understood the following things. 1, you needed to tell someone. 2, telling someone meant the authorities would come. 3, the authorities coming meant one thing. They would take you to the island. The plague authorities of Venice moved with a speed that was almost impressive, considering that everything else in Venice moved at the pace of bureaucracy soaking in honey. The provveditori alla sanità, the health officials, had been managing this outbreak for 2 months by the time they came for you. They were organised. They had a system. The system was, if you had the plague, you went to the Lazzaretto Vecchio, the old Lazzaretto, an island in the lagoon about a mile from the city that had been serving as Venice's plague hospital since 1423. 150 years of plague, of the sick and the dying, of the desperate attempts at treatment and the silent failures and the bodies wrapped in canvas and dropped into the lagoon water. You didn't tell your landlord, a pious man named Benedetto Zorzi, who attended Mass every morning and cheated every tenant he had, would have called the authorities within the hour and then charged your corpse for the extra room. You told another porter instead, a man named Silvio, who had worked alongside you at the Rialto for 11 months and who owed you 3 soldi from a card game the previous winter. Silvio looked at the swelling under your arm and went pale in a way that people describe but you rarely actually see in another person's face, the blood genuinely draining away, leaving the skin the colour of old tallow. "I'll get the doctor," he said. The doctor he got was not actually a doctor, he was a barber surgeon, a tall man in his 40s named Maestro Vincenzo, who wore a beak-shaped mask filled with herbs and charged extra for house calls because this was not actually a house call profession in a plague year. Maestro Vincenzo looked at the swelling. He looked at your eyes. He held a candle close to your face and made a sound in the back of his throat that communicated nothing useful. "You need to report yourself," he said. "I know. If you don't report and they find out, I know." He left without treating you. There was nothing to treat, not here, not with what he had. Silvio reported you. He did it because he had no choice. The penalties for harbouring an unreported plague victim were severe, and he did it with what you understood, even through the fog of fever, was genuine sorrow. "I'll keep your boots," he said, "until you come back." He didn't believe you were coming back. You could hear it in the way he said it. The boots were already his in his mind, but saying it was a kindness. The men from the sanitar arrived 2 hours later. There were 3 of them. They wore the long canvas coats, the gloves, the beak masks that made them look like enormous birds of prey. They moved carefully, touching as little as possible, speaking in short sentences through the herbs packed into the beaks of their masks. They were not cruel men. You want to say that about them, because it seems important. They did not enjoy their work. They handled you with a kind of brisk professionalism that was almost gentle in its efficiency. One of them took your arm to help you walk. Another gathered the few things you were allowed to bring: a clean shirt, a rosary, a small carved wooden saint that your mother had pressed into your hands when you left for Venice. The third one was already in the corner, making a note in his ledger. Name, parish, symptoms, date. That was you. A name, a parish, 3 symptoms, and a date. The boat was waiting at the nearest canal. The boats used to transport plague victims were called sanitation barges, and they were exactly what that name suggests. Flat-bottomed, heavy, designed for cargo rather than comfort, smelling of the vinegar and smoke that the boatmen used to try to keep themselves alive. You were not the only passenger. There were 4 others in the barge when they helped you aboard. They lay on pallets of straw, separated from each other by the practical distance of people who have given up on proximity. An old man who was past speaking and lay with his eyes half open, staring at the sky. A woman, maybe 30 years old, who had wrapped her arms around herself and was shaking in a way that was not cold. A boy, you couldn't tell his age, maybe 15, maybe younger, sitting upright with an expression of rigid control, as if he believed that if he held himself still enough, the world would hold still with him. And a man your own age who looked at you when you climbed in and gave a nod that meant, "Yes, I see you," We're the same thing now. You lay down on the empty pallet and looked at the sky. It was a perfect blue, the kind of blue Venice does in August when the light bounces off the lagoon and everything seems too bright, oversaturated, as if God turned up the contrast. A few high white clouds moved slowly from west to east. The boatman pushed off from the fondamenta without ceremony. The barge moved out into the canal, into the wider waterway, past the buildings that lined the bank, past the faces of people who looked and then looked away. You watched the city recede. You'd been in Venice for 14 months. You had carried loads across every sestiere, every neighbourhood, every bridge and alley and sottoportico. You knew the city by its smell and its weight and its particular way of catching light in the early morning when the canals go flat and silver and the buildings reflect in them perfectly, upside down, and for a moment you can believe you're walking between two Venice, one above and one below. You were watching it disappear behind you, and you could not tell if you would ever see it from the inside again. The lagoon opened up around you. The islands of Venice shrank. You could see the dome of San Marco, the tower of the Campanile, the rooftops you knew so well from having spent 14 months below them. The water was greenish-brown and flat. Seabirds wheeled overhead. The boatmen rowed in silence. Nobody spoke. What is there to say on a plague barge? The conversation has already been had. The future has been considered. All the things that needed to be settled have been settled or abandoned. You're going to the island, and the island is where things end or don't end, and there's nothing to do about it now. You closed your eyes. The fever made the motion of the boat feel like more motion than there was, like the barge was rolling over much larger waves than the flat lagoon could actually produce. The darkness behind your eyelids was not peaceful. It had shapes in it, colours that moved. You focused on the smell, not the good smells. There weren't good smells on this barge, but the smells themselves, salt, vinegar, the sour warmth of the woman across from you, the canvas of your palette. Beneath everything, the particular mud and rot smell of the lagoon. Somewhere to your left, the old man made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. Nobody responded. The barge kept moving. And then, after what might have been an hour or might have been 10 minutes, time does strange things inside a fever. The barge slowed, and you heard the knock of wood against stone, and you knew you had arrived. The island of the Lazzaretto Vecchio is small, maybe 200 metres long, 100 metres wide. A flat piece of reclaimed ground in the lagoon, unremarkable except for what has been built on it. What has been built on it is a large square complex, stone walls, a central courtyard, buildings arranged around the perimeter. From the water, it looks almost like a monastery, which is not an accident. The same logic that applied to saving souls was applied, with uncertain success, to saving bodies. Around the main complex, additional buildings have been added over the years as the plague has come and gone and come again. A women's ward, a men's ward, a separate building for the convalescents, the ones who are getting better, who need to be kept apart from the ones who are getting worse. Storage buildings, a chapel, a small garden where medicinal herbs are grown, though there are no herbs yet discovered that reliably cure the plague. The garden is mostly for the comfort of looking at something living. The wall that surrounds it all is not for keeping people out. It is for keeping people in. You understood this when you first saw it. The men who helped you off the barge were different from the men who'd collected you. These men were pizzigamorti, literally those who pinch the dead. The workers of the Lazzaretto, the men who carried the sick from the barges, who changed the bedding, who collected the bodies in the morning. They wore the same beak masks, the same canvas coats. Their eyes above the masks were blank and professional. One of them took your arm, not roughly, just firmly. The way you handle something that might break. Name? Giacomo Beltrame. From where? Treviso. Working in Venice. Porter at the Rialto. He wrote something down. Did not react to the information, one way or another. Ward B, he said to the other man. Ward B. You had no idea what that meant, whether it was better or worse than Ward A, Ward C, whether it meant anything at all beyond the administrative need to put you somewhere specific. You were about to find out. The path from the dock to the ward led through the main courtyard, and you saw the Lazzaretto Vecchio for the first time in full daylight. It was August 5th, 1576, about 3 in the afternoon. The courtyard was large and square and filled with people in various stages of dying. You need to understand what that means. Not the abstract knowing, the knowing you had, living in Venice, hearing the bells, understanding that the plague was killing people. The concrete, physical, unavoidable knowing that comes from being in the same enclosed space as approximately 200 sick human beings. The smell reached you first. It hit you like something physical, like a hand pressing against your face. It was not one smell, it was layers. The first layer was something sweet, not the good sweet, not honey or ripe fruit, the wrong sweet. The sweet of flesh that is beginning to change into something else. The sweet of bodies already partially in the process of becoming something other than bodies. Beneath that, the sharp, eye-watering sting of vinegar and sulfur. Every surface had been washed in vinegar. Fires burned in iron baskets at the corners of the courtyard, sending up thick smoke that smelled of sulphur and burning herbs. The Venetian authorities believed that the plague was transmitted by bad air, miasma, and the answer to bad air was different air. Burning things, changing the smell. It didn't work, but the smoke was everywhere. Beneath the vinegar and the sulphur, the smell of human bodies in distress. Sweat that is not clean sweat, but sick sweat. The particular sharp, sour smell of fever. And beneath that, you forced yourself not to think too specifically about this. The smell of bodies that had stopped being able to manage themselves. There was no romance to it, no noble suffering. This was humanity stripped down to its most basic, its most animal, its most helpless. People lay on pallets arranged around the edges of the courtyard. Some lay in the buildings that opened onto it. The lucky ones were inside. The less lucky ones were in the open air, which in August in Venice meant the full weight of the afternoon sun. Most of them lay still. A few moved. A woman near the far wall was sitting up, looking at her hands with an expression of profound confusion, as if her hands had done something unexpected. A man 2 pallets away was praying. You could hear it, the words barely audible beneath the general low noise of the place, a murmur, a repetition. An old woman lay completely still, and you could not tell, from where you stood, whether she was breathing. The man next to you, the worker, the pizzigamort, said, "This way." He led you through the courtyard, past the pallets, past the prayers and the stillness and the smell, to a door that opened into a long, low building. Ward B, the ward was 30 metres long and maybe 8 wide. Stone floor, stone walls, small windows set high up, covered with oiled cloth rather than glass. Not enough windows to move the air, enough to let in a grey, diffuse light that made everything look underwater. Down each long wall, pallets, not proper beds, pallets, straw stuffed into canvas, laid directly on the floor. About 6 inches of straw between you and the cold stone, space between pallets just wide enough to walk through if you turned sideways. Approximately 40 pallets. Approximately 30 of them occupied. The sound of the ward was something you would spend weeks trying to describe and never fully succeed at. The closest you can get is, it was a collection of the sounds that human beings make when they are not trying to make sounds. The involuntary sounds, breathing that is working too hard, the low continuous sound of pain that has been present long enough to stop being specific and has become the background note of existence. A cough from somewhere in the middle of the room that sounded wrong, too wet, too produced. And beneath it all, the sound of rats moving in the walls, quick, skittering, confident. They know something you don't know. They know what this room eventually becomes. A woman came to meet you at the door. She was maybe 50 years old, short and wide, wearing an apron that had once been white. She moved the way that people move when they have been doing the same work in the same space for a long time. Efficiently, without wasted motion, without particular emotion attached to any specific thing she was doing. Name? Giacomo. How long have you had the swelling? Since yesterday morning, under my right arm. She looked at you. Her eyes, above the cloth she'd wrapped around the lower half of her face, the poor woman's version of a beak mask, were brown and steady and very tired. Fever? Yes. Headache? Yes. Can you eat? You had not thought about eating. The question arrived in your mind and stayed there for a moment, strange. I don't know. You'll try. 3rd pallet from the end on the left. There's a bucket beside it. Use the bucket. She said this in the tone of someone who has explained this many times. My name is Katerina. If you need something, ask me. If I'm not here, wait. She turned away before you finished nodding. Your pallet was at the far end of the ward. You walked to it through the close heat of 40 sick bodies, past the wet sound of breathing, past a man who was staring at the ceiling with eyes wide open and an expression that suggested either peace or its opposite, past a young woman who was curled on her side with her knees pulled to her chest, asleep or unconscious. You lay down. The straw was not clean. It was never fully clean in a place like this. They changed it when they could, which was not as often as they should have. It smelled of the previous occupant, or possibly, occupants plural, a composite smell of sweat and illness, and the particular sourness of bodies that have spent days not moving far. Your hip pressed down through the canvas into straw that had been compressed by the weight of many people before you, and underneath the straw the cold of the stone floor came up regardless. You lay on your left side to keep the pressure off the swelling. The stone floor was just visible through the thin canvas of the pallet. Cold, even in August, because stone is always cold. The cold came up through the straw and into your hip and your left shoulder and your ear. Above you the ceiling was low and vaulted, old stone, blackened by years of lamp smoke. There was a crack in the vault above your head that ran from somewhere near the window to somewhere near the wall, and a small plant was growing in it, a weed of some kind, pale and determined, finding its purchase in the mortared gap. Something was alive in the wall next to you. You could hear it moving. You closed your eyes. This was the Lazzaretto Vecchio. This was where you were going to get better, or you were going to die. one or the other. You lay still and waited to find out which. Sleep came for you quickly the first afternoon, the fever dragging you under before you had time to fully understand where you were. What sleep means inside a fever is not what sleep normally means. Normal sleep is a quiet place, a turning off. Fever sleep is busy. It has images that are too bright and too present, conversations with people who are not there, rooms that keep changing their dimensions. You walk through Venice and the bridges keep moving. You lift a crate at the Rialto and the crate is empty but weighs as much as a house. Your mother's voice comes from somewhere you can't locate. You woke periodically to the ward around you, to the sounds and the smell and the specific pressure of the stone floor coming up through the straw. And each time you woke, the light from the high windows was different, so you could track the passing hours by the angle of illumination on the ceiling. But this was not precise, and your sense of time was already unreliable. At some point in what you calculated was the late evening, Caterina came with a wooden bowl. The bowl contained a kind of thin soup. You looked at it and thought the word soup, which was generous. It was primarily hot water with what you suspected was a small amount of grain dissolved in it, and something else that might have been a piece of dried vegetable, or might have been something you preferred not to identify. "Drink it," Caterina said. "What is it?" "Something hot." She gave you the direct, flat look of someone explaining a reality that does not benefit from elaboration. You need to drink. You need to keep your body working as long as possible. This is what we have. You drank it. It tasted the way it looked, warm and thin and indistinct, but it was something. Your stomach, which had been empty since before the barge, accepted it without protest, too exhausted to be particular. Caterina moved on to the next pallet. The man there, your nearest neighbour, looked up at her with the expression of a man who's been awake for a long time and is using all of his remaining energy to remain that way. He was older than you, maybe 40, with a face that had once been handsome and had been rearranged by life and illness into something that still showed the shape of what it had been. His name, you would learn later, was Matteo. Ser Matteo, he introduced himself the following morning with a kind of exhausted dignity that you found both pathetic and oddly moving. He had been, he told you, a merchant of modest success. Not one of the great Venetian merchant families, not a Grimani or a Barbarigo or a Mocenigo, but a man who had built, over 20 years of careful work, a business importing cloth from the mainland and selling it to the dressmakers and tailors who supplied the noble women of the city. He had a house, not a palazzo, but a proper house, with rooms that didn't share walls with strangers. He had a wife, 2 daughters, and a small garden. The wife and daughters were gone, he said. He didn't elaborate on where. "Gone," he said, in a tone that closed the question. He had been in the Lazzaretto for 8 days. He was still alive. He considered this significant. "They tell you," he said, "that 8 days is the turning point. If you last 8 days, your chances improve. I've lasted 8 days. He looked at you across the narrow gap between the pallets, maybe 3 feet, close enough to hear him breathe. "You're young," he said. "The young do better, usually." It was an observation, not a comfort. He was reporting a fact, the way a merchant reports the current price of cloth, simply and without embellishment. "What happens?" you asked. "After the 8 days. Some get better, some get worse." He shifted carefully, wincing. The bubo, you would understand later, made any movement in the upper body agonizing. Each shift of the shoulder or the arm sent lightning through the swelling and up into the neck and through the skull. You had already discovered this yourself, lying on your side and trying not to breathe too deeply. The ones who get better have a few more weeks. Then they let you go to the Nuovo, the other island for people still quarantining, and then back to the city. And the ones who get worse? Silence. Then they move them to the other end of the ward. You looked toward the far end of the ward. The far end was darker, the pallets there further apart, the stillness different in quality. You stopped asking questions. In the morning of your second day you met Fra Benedetto. He arrived at first light, which came slowly through the high oiled windows in the specific pale grey Venice way of early morning. The light not quite any colour yet, not quite committed to being day. You heard him before you saw him. This sound of a man moving through the ward with purpose, with a different kind of movement than the pizzigamorti, who moved with the economy of people performing a task. Fra Benedetto moved with the energy of a man who has decided something and is living according to that decision. He was a Franciscan friar. That much was clear from the brown habit, the cord at the waist, the sandals on the bare feet that moved across the cold stone floor. He was somewhere between 40 and 60, the particular indeterminate age of men who have lived hard and kept themselves lean. His face was lean too, with deep lines around the eyes that might have been laughter or might have been grief and were probably both. He was not wearing a beak mask. This struck you immediately. Everyone in the Lazzaretto wore masks. The workers, the doctors on the occasions they appeared, even Caterina covered her lower face with cloth. It was not a choice you made. It is a condition of working in a place like this. Fra Benedetto had nothing over his face. You asked about this later. God will protect me, he said. Do you believe that? He thought about this with a seriousness that suggested he had considered it carefully and recently. I believe that I have chosen to be here. God may or may not have arranged that choice. Either way, the choice is made. A mask would not change what I'm willing to risk. This was either faith or fatalism, and you were not sure there was a meaningful difference. Fra Benedetto went up and down the ward, stopping at each pallet, crouching down to the level of the people lying there, speaking quietly. You watched him work. He was not a doctor. He was not treating the sickness directly. What he was doing was something harder to name. He was present with people, fully present, without the professional distance that the workers maintained, without the protective blankness that kept you from absorbing too much of what was around you. He sat with a woman 2 pallets away for 20 minutes. You could not hear what they said. When he stood, the woman's face was different, not better. She was not less sick, not less frightened. But something had changed in the quality of her distress. It had been witnessed. Someone had sat with it. He came to you. You're new, he said. He crouched down, bringing himself to your level. His eyes were steady and very brown and looked at you the way that certain people look at you, as if you are specifically the person in front of them, not a category of person, not a task. Yesterday, you said. Where are you from? Treviso, working as a porter in Venice. He nodded. I know Treviso. I walked through it once years ago on the way to Milan. There's not much to see. There's a church with very good frescoes. He paused. I'm Fra Benedetto. I've been here for 6 weeks. You're not sick. Not yet. He said it simply, without drama. A fact. Aren't you? You stopped. Afraid? He thought about it. I'm a friar. I've taken vows. One of the things I've promised is to be present where I am needed. This is where I am needed." He looked round the ward. "The city is dying. Someone should be here with it while it does." He said it without self-pity and without pride. It was the most matter-of-fact description of heroism you had ever heard. "How many survive?" you asked. You'd been wanting to ask since you arrived, and had not asked Caterina because her eyes suggested the answer was not one she wanted to give. Fra Benedetto was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet. Considering quiet. The quiet of a man choosing his words because he respects you enough to be honest. "Of the ones who arrive as sick as you are," he said, "maybe 1 in 3 returns to the city." 1 in 3. You kept your face still. You had known the number would be bad. Somehow hearing it stated precisely made it more real, and also, strangely, more manageable. A number is something you can work with. 1 in 3 means the game is not yet lost. 1 in 3 means there is still something to hope for. "The ones who survive," you said. "What makes the difference?" He was quiet again. Then, "The will to eat, the will to move, even when moving is agony, and," he looked at you very directly, "the ability to not give up before the fever breaks. The fever is the worst part. It takes longer than people expect, and in the middle of it, the body and the mind both want to stop." He put his hand briefly on your shoulder. You could feel the weight and warmth of it through the rough fabric of your shirt. "Don't stop," he said, and then he stood and moved to the next pallet. The social geography of the Lazzaretto Vecchio was not what you expected. You had assumed, perhaps naively, that the plague was a great equalizer, that the disease did not care if you were a doge or a dock worker. And in the biological sense, this was true. The bacterium that caused the plague, though no one in 1576 knew what a bacterium was, no one had the vocabulary for what was killing them, did not care about your social standing. It moved through the flea bites of infected rats, and it entered your bloodstream, and it did what it did, regardless. But the Lazzaretto Vecchio was not run by the bacterium. It was run by the Republic of Venice, and the Republic of Venice had opinions about social standing. Ward B, your ward, was for the poor. The facchini and the fishermen and the servants and the washerwomen and the bakers and the men who kept Venice functioning at its most basic level, and who were, in the economy of the plague hospital, worth a pallet and a thin soup, and the attention of 1 nurse and 1 friar. Ward A was different. You didn't see Ward A until your 4th day, when the fever had receded slightly. It came and went in waves, you were learning, not a steady state but a tide, and you were able to walk a little. Ward A had proper beds, not luxurious. Nothing in the Lazzaretto was luxurious, but raised off the floor with actual mattresses of wool batting rather than straw. Separate spaces, curtains between the pallets to give the illusion of privacy, a dedicated attendant. The food in Ward A was also different. You learned this from Ser Matteo, who had enough connections to have received actual broth with pieces of real chicken, and had been moved to Ward B because the Lazzaretto was overcrowded, and the social mathematics of the plague hospital required that certain flexibilities be made. He had not, in 8 days, stopped being furious about it. "I paid," he said. "My family paid. The money went directly to the sanità. There is a record. I am entitled to ward a treatment." You said nothing. Your back ached from the floor and you were sweating despite the cool of the stone wall, and you had other concerns. "It's not the beds," he continued. He was a man who needed to talk, who processed his situation through speech, relentlessly. "It's the principle. In Venice there are rules, there are contracts. I paid for something, and I am not receiving what I paid for. You thought about this, about the idea of contracts and rules, and what they were worth in a plague hospital. Ser Matteo, you said, are you going to die arguing about the beds? A pause. Very possibly, he said. And despite everything, the smell and the fever and the sound of the man at the far end of the ward who had been making the same low noise for 2 days, you almost laughed. A small, dry thing that was mostly just the shape of a laugh. But something. Ser Matteo almost laughed too. It was the beginning of something, not friendship exactly. Proximity made you into a unit of survival. 2 people watching each other for signs of deterioration, reporting back. You're worse, he would say in the mornings when the fever came back. The swelling is softer, he would report on better days. That's supposed to be good. When it softens, it's beginning to resolve. He knew things about the plague that you didn't. He'd had time to ask questions, and unlike you, he'd had the social confidence to demand answers from the physicians when they occasionally appeared. The physicians appeared rarely. There were not enough of them in Venice. There had never been enough, and the plague had reduced the supply further, because physicians were not immune to the plague, and some of them had acted accordingly and left the city. The ones who remained at the Lazzaretto were doing their best under conditions that made best very relative. The physician who appeared on your 3rd day was a small, precise man named Dr. Marcello. He moved through the ward with the speed and focus of a man who has too much to do and is perpetually aware of it. He wore the full plague doctor's costume, the beak mask, the full-length wax-coated coat, the leather gloves, and he moved in it with the practised ease of someone who had worn it for so long it had become a second skin. He examined you quickly, pressed the bubo with gloved fingers while you tried not to make a sound, looked at your tongue, your eyes, asked about the fever, about whether you could eat. The swelling is here, he said, pressing. And here. He was noting not just the primary bubo under your arm, but a secondary hardness that had developed in your armpit proper, which you hadn't noticed until he touched it, and the pain arrived so fast and bright it made your vision go white for a moment. Bloodletting, he said to Caterina, who was beside him making notes. Today, if possible. Bloodletting. You knew about bloodletting. Everyone knew about bloodletting. The humoral theory of medicine, the idea that the body was governed by 4 humours, blood and phlegm and yellow bile and black bile, and that illness was a matter of these humours falling out of balance, was the operating framework of European medicine in 1576 and had been for centuries. The cure for excess blood, for fever, for the particular overheated quality of plague, was to remove some of the blood. You lay still and thought, they're going to cut me. How much? You asked. Dr. Marcello looked at you. Behind the mask his eyes were professionally neutral. Enough. Not too much. You need to keep your strength. This was the extent of the consultation. Bloodletting happened that afternoon. Caterina performed it. The doctor was in 3 other wards simultaneously. She came with a small leather case that contained the lancets, thin, sharp blades that she maintained with the specific care that useful tools receive when they are used constantly. She lit an extra candle. She told you to hold still. She opened a vein at your left elbow, a thin cut, quick, precise. The blood came slowly at first, then faster. Dark red in the candle light. She held a ceramic bowl underneath. You watched the blood fall into the bowl and felt the particular vertiginous sensation of watching your own body lose something it is supposed to keep, the slight dizzy remoteness that came with it. the way the edges of the room got softer. It was not as painful as the bubo. The cut itself was brief and sharp. The bloodletting was. This was the strange part, almost relaxing, in the way that surrendering to a process beyond your control is relaxing. You couldn't do anything. You could only lie there and let it happen, and watch the candle flame and breathe. Caterina's hands were efficient and practiced. She watched the bowl and the vein with the careful attention of someone managing a resource. Too much blood removed and the patient weakened dangerously. Too little and the treatment was ineffective. It was judgment, accumulated over years of doing this every day in a place where the consequences were immediate and measurable. "You've done this many times," you said. "Yes." "Does it work?" She wrapped a cloth around your arm and tied it with neat, quick movements. "Some survive, some don't." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have." She stood, picked up the bowl, which you tried not to look at, and moved to the next pallet. You lay still and felt lighter than you had since you arrived. Whether that was the bloodletting or just your body's natural inclination toward darkness, you couldn't say. The fever came back that night. Worse. There's a kind of suffering that strips away everything that is not essential. You had lived your whole life with the basic architecture of a self, preferences, memories, plans, worries, the whole accumulated structure of being Giacomo Beltram, born in a village outside Treviso, third son of a farmer, arrived in Venice with 14 months of carrying other people's burdens on your back. This structure was something you inhabited without noticing it, the way you inhabit the air. Fever took it apart. Not all at once, not cruelly, just a piece at a time, until what remained was the bare essentials, the sensation of being a body that wanted to continue existing. The weight of the blanket, thin wool, rough at the edges, smelling of vinegar and whoever had used it before you. The cold of the stone floor coming through the straw. The sounds of the ward. The particular consistency of your own breathing. The fever moved in waves. You came to understand this pattern after the first 2 days. A build-up through the morning hours, arriving at its height in the early afternoon, when the temperature outside was also at its highest, and the ward became an enclosed system of heat. Then a slight recession in the evening, not gone but retreated like a tide. Then back again in the night, worse. During the worst of it, you saw things that were not there. Not dramatic hallucinations, not the vivid theatrical nightmares you might have expected. Small displacements. The man on the pallet across the ward would be speaking and then not speaking, and you couldn't be certain which of those states was real. The crack in the vault above your head grew longer and then shorter. Your mother appeared at the window once, looking in from outside, and was gone when you tried to focus on her face. You did not find these visions particularly frightening. They were too vague for that, too distant. They belonged to the fever, and the fever was a country you were visiting. The bubo was the specific reality that kept pulling you back. It had grown since your arrival, which Ser Matteo said was expected, that they grew before they resolved, and in the 3rd and 4th days it reached a size and a quality of pressure that made lying down a negotiation. Left side, bad. Right side, agony. Back. The swelling pressed against the pallet, and the pain was immediate and absolute. You spent those days on your left side, knees slightly bent, left arm extended, trying not to breathe too deeply. Breathing deeply expanded your chest, which engaged the muscles under your arm, which moved the swelling. You became an expert in small, precise breathing. The ward made this difficult. The air in Ward B was not good air. The windows were kept closed. More miasma theory. The belief that cold air carried contagion. The braziers of burning herbs produced smoke that was supposed to purify, but mostly just reduced visibility and added another layer to the ward's existing sensory complexity. 40 sick people in a sealed room in August in Venice. You breathed small and tried not to think about what you were breathing. On the fourth day, Fra Benedetto sat beside you for an hour. He did not speak for most of it. He sat cross-legged on the floor next to your pallet. There was no chair, no stool, and read from a small book that he held in his lap, occasionally looking up at the ward or at you, then back at his book. Eventually you asked, "What are you reading?" "Augustine." He showed you the book, a small, dense volume, the pages dark with use. "What does he say?" Fra Benedetto thought about it. Many things. He says that our heart is restless until it rests in God. He looked at you. He also says that we should not mourn for those who die, because death is not an ending. I find this useful here. Do you believe it? The part about it not being an ending? He was quiet for a long moment. The ward breathed around you both. Someone coughed. "I believe that these people deserved more than this," he said finally. "Whatever comes after, they deserved more than this. That I'm certain of." It was not what you had expected him to say. It was more useful. On the fifth day, Dr. Marcello came back. He looked at the bubo and made a sound that communicated something, though you couldn't read what. "We'll lance it," he said. "You had been waiting for this. Ser Matteo had told you it was coming, that the standard progression was growth, then lancing, then drainage, then resolution or not. The lancing itself he described with the careful detachment of a man reporting facts about something unpleasant that has happened to someone else. It's not the lancet you'll remember, Ser Matteo had said. It's what comes after. Caterina prepared you. She brought the lancet, a heavier instrument than the bloodletting lancet, broader, with a different weight to it. She brought clean cloth. She brought a small ceramic pot with a lid, which she set nearby without explaining its purpose, and you chose not to ask. "Hold still," she said. "You'd heard this before. The lancet went in. The pain was, you searched for language afterward, when you could think again, and language failed. The pain was specific and absolute. It occupied your entire available consciousness for the moment it occurred, crowding out everything else, the ward, the smells, the fever, the thin wool blanket, the sound of Ser Matteo's careful breathing nearby, and filled the space where yourself had been with just the fact of the pain, complete and terrible. It lasted a second, maybe two, and then the release. Caterina worked efficiently, pressing the bubo carefully with her thumbs, and what came out, what had been building and pressing and hurting for 5 days, came out, and with it came the pressure. And the pressure had been so constant and so large that its absence felt like something physical. Like a hand that had been pressing on you for days suddenly lifting away. You lay in the aftermath of this, breathing carefully, and felt the specific strange relief of a body that has just expelled something it very badly needed to expel. "That's good," Caterina said quietly as she worked. It was the most positive statement she'd made since your arrival. "It means your body is fighting," she added. "Some buboes don't drain. When they don't drain, that's—" She stopped, tied off the wound with quick, neat movements. This one drained well. She cleaned the wound with vinegar, which burned in a completely different and more immediate way than the bubo pain, and dressed it with a linen cloth soaked in an unguent that smelled strongly of herbal compounds you couldn't identify. "Rest," she said. "You were already resting. You had been resting for 5 days. You were becoming an expert at rest. But that night, for the first time, you slept something close to actual sleep. Not the frantic fever sleep of the first days. Something heavier, quieter, with fewer visitors. You woke in the grey early morning, and the ward smelled the same, and sounded the same, and was the same, and the fever was not gone. It was still there, a low simmer, waiting, but it was less. Fra Benedetto was already moving through the ward. "You look better," he said when he reached you. "I don't feel better. Better is relative here. You look less like you've decided to give up." You lay there and considered this. "I hadn't decided to give up," you said. "Good." He crouched down. "Then don't start now. The second week is when it becomes a question of will. The body has done what it can. The rest is the mind." He said it the way he said everything, directly, without drama, as if it were simply true. "Fra Benedetto," you said, "why are you really here?" He looked at you, considering. "I had a parish," he said, "a small parish in Castello. When the plague started, I could have left. Many did. Many priests left the city. You can't blame them. They have families, obligations, lives. I had only my vows." He paused. "My vows say that I go where I am needed, and nowhere in Venice is more needed than here. That's the official reason." He made a sound, something between a laugh and a sigh. "The unofficial reason. My brother died of plague 20 years ago in an earlier outbreak. He was 21. I was 14 and couldn't help him." He looked at the floor, at the ward, at something that wasn't in this room. "I couldn't help him then. I can help someone now." He stood. "Eat your soup today," he said. "All of it, even if you don't want to." And he moved on to the next pallet. The night of the 14th came in quietly. August in Venice does not cool in the evening, not really. The stone walls hold the heat of the day and release it slowly through the night. The lagoon holds its heat, and the city sits on the lagoon and breathes out warmth all night long. And by the grey light hours of early morning, the air is barely cooler than it was at noon. In the ward, this meant that the night was its own kind of suffering. The bodies of 40 people packed close generated heat that added to the August heat. The ward became a sealed system of warmth and bad air, and the sounds of people trying to endure. You had developed practice for the nights. You focused on specific sounds, not the frightening ones, not the cough from the far end that had been getting wetter, not the low monotonous sound from the pallet of the woman with the red hair who had arrived 2 days after you and who seemed unable to stop making a sound that wasn't quite a groan and wasn't quite anything else. Not those. Instead, the rats in the walls, which were oddly rhythmic and peaceful when you detached them from what they meant. The drip of water somewhere in the complex, not your ward, but something adjacent. A slow, intermittent drip that ticked off time in irregular intervals. The breathing of the ward itself. 40 people breathing in their own rhythms, their own patterns, their own struggles. On the night of the 14th, you woke around what you estimated was the 3rd hour after midnight. You woke because the sound of the ward had changed. Not louder, emptier. This is the sound you couldn't have described beforehand, couldn't have imagined as something you would recognize. But lying in the dark with your eyes still closed, before you were fully conscious, you knew it. A room with 40 people breathing has a specific acoustic quality. A room with fewer people breathing has a different one. You opened your eyes. The ward was lit by a single oil lamp at the far end, the one Caterina left burning through the night so she could see to move if necessary. The light was dim and cast long shadows across the pallets. 3 of the shadows were still, not the stillness of sleep, not even the stillness of deep illness, the other stillness, the one that is absolute. At the far end of the ward, 2 pallets that occupied the wall were empty in a specific way, not empty as in the person has gotten up and left, empty as in the person has gone somewhere a pallet cannot follow. And in the middle of the room, 2 pallets from you. The pallet of the woman with the red hair was still. The sound she'd been making, that not groan, not cry that had been part of the ward's vocabulary for 2 nights, was gone. The ward breathed on. 37 people instead of 40, generating slightly less heat, slightly less sound. You lay still. You did not know any of these people's names, except Ser Matteo and Fra Benedetto and Caterina. But you had been breathing their air for 9 days. You had been part of the same sealed system. Their sounds had been part of your sleep and your waking, and now 3 of them were simply not there. The rats moved in the wall. The oil lamp guttered slightly as if it too had noticed. From somewhere outside the ward, from the courtyard, from the complex, from the night, a bell began to ring. It rang 3 times, slow and flat and patient. The way bells ring in the dark, indifferent to whether anyone is listening or not. You had learned what 3 bells meant. You had learned many of the Lazzaretto's codes in your 9 days here, the signals that organise the work of caring for this many dying people, the shorthand of a place that had been doing this for 150 years and had developed its own language. 3 bells meant, come and take the dead. You heard footsteps in the corridor outside, the specific heavy tread of the pizziga morti, the men who did this work, 2 or 3 of them, moving with the practised efficiency of men who had done this task many times tonight, and would do it many times before morning. The door opened. The light from their torch filled the ward briefly, then receded as they closed the door mostly behind them. They moved to the first still pallet. You closed your eyes. You heard the sounds of this work. You could not avoid hearing them. The ward was 30 metres long and you were at the far end and the sounds carried. The sounds of a body being wrapped in canvas, the dry rustle of it, the compression of weight, the sounds of 2 men lifting, the sounds of something being carried down the length of the ward past your pallet, close enough that you could feel the slight displacement of air, past you and gone. They came back for the second and the third. Each time the door opened and closed, the torchlight came and went like an unsteady sun. And then they were done, and the ward was just the ward again, diminished, quieter, continuing. You lay in the dark and thought about the 3 people who had been here and were not here. The woman with the red hair who'd been making a sound for 2 days and had now stopped making any sound. The old man at the far end whose face you'd never seen clearly. The person in the other far pallet. You had not even known the name, the age, the face. A sound in the dark. A presence in the collective breathing. Gone now. Processed. Wrapped in canvas and carried off to somewhere you did not know. In the morning their pallets would be washed with vinegar and given to the next arrivals. The barge came every day. There were always more. You were lying in the middle of this process, this endless cycle of arrival and departure. You had arrived. You were still here. You might depart in either direction. You thought about Fra Benedetto's brother, 21 years old, dying of plague, with a 14-year-old who could only watch. You thought about your own brother back in Treviso. He was 17 now, apprenticed to a cobbler, had never been to Venice, had no plans to go as far as you knew. You hoped he never went. No, that was wrong. Venice was worth knowing. Venice, with all its noise and weight and canal smell and tides of commerce, was a thing worth knowing. You did not regret your 14 months in it. You just wanted to go back. Ser Matteo was awake. You could hear it in the quality of his breathing, the slight irregularity of someone awake and processing, different from the steady rhythm of sleep. 3, he said softly. You didn't have to ask what he meant. 3, you confirmed. Silence. Then, the numbers vary. Some nights it's 1, some nights more. How many in a night? At most? I heard... He stopped, reconsidered. I heard from one of the workers that last month there was a night when 11 went in one ward. 11? Out of perhaps 40? More than a quarter of a ward? In a single night? This is not that kind of night, Ser Matteo added. No. These 3 were. They had been declining. It was visible. The physician could see it. Were you declining when he examined you? A long pause, long enough that you regretted asking. Temporarily, Ser Matteo said. You let it rest. The bell rang once more, somewhere deeper in the complex. Not a death toll this time. Something else, a signal you hadn't learned yet. The night carried on. Outside, the lagoon existed in its ancient patient way, indifferent to what happened on this small island in its midst. Somewhere across the water, Venice went on. You wondered who was awake in it at this hour, what they were doing, whether they knew on this specific night that 3 people on this island had stopped. They probably did in the aggregate. The numbers were reported, the bells were rung, the counting was kept, but the specific 3, the red-haired woman, the old man, the unnamed other, those 3 were known now only here, in this ward, to the people who had breathed alongside them, and eventually not even here. In a week the pallets would have new occupants, the faces would be different, the sounds would be different. The ward would carry on. You thought, I am going to carry on, not as hope exactly, more as decision, the deliberate choice that Fra Benedetto had talked about. The decision you make not once but continuously, over and over, in the small recurring moments when the alternative presents itself. I am going to carry on. You breathed the bad air of the ward and made this choice, and then you lay still and waited for morning. The theriac arrived on day 11. Venice treacle, theriaca di Venezia, was, in 1576, one of the most famous medicines in the world. Venice had been producing it for centuries, under strictly controlled conditions, under the supervision of the official health board, in a process that was part pharmaceutical production and part civic ceremony. The formula was ancient, attributed variously to the physician Galen, to the Greek king Mithridates, to sources so old that their origins were more myth than history. It contained, depending on which recipe you consulted, anywhere from 40 to 64 ingredients. Some of these ingredients were opium, viper flesh, cinnamon, galangal, ginger, rhubarb, saffron, castoreum, myrrh, bitumen, and 30 or more other compounds, herbal and mineral and animal, combined and dried and ground and recombined in a process that took months. The result was a thick, dark paste with a smell that was simultaneously medicinal and sweet, and something else. Something you couldn't name but would recognize again if you encountered it. The way you recognize the smell of a specific place you visited once in childhood. Dr. Marcello brought it himself. A small clay pot sealed with wax. He administered it with a wooden spoon, a specific measured amount. "Swallow it," he said. You swallowed it. The taste was complex in the way that something made from 64 ingredients is always going to be complex. Sweet first, the honey and the saffron, then the medicinal weight of it, the dense herbal bitterness, then, underneath everything, something else. Something warm that moved down your throat and settled in your stomach and began, slowly, to spread outward. The opium, you understood later. A significant component of the theriac was opium, which did not cure the plague but made the person significantly more able to tolerate being someone who had the plague. Within an hour, the fever felt less like an assault and more like weather. Present, persistent, but something you were moving through rather than something that was happening to you. Your thoughts came more clearly. This was both good and complicated. With clearer thoughts came the full reckoning of your situation. You were lying on a straw pallet in a plague hospital on a small island in the Venetian lagoon. You had been here 11 days. You had watched 3 people die in a single night. You'd been bled and lanced and dosed with medicine that was primarily ancient opiates combined with the flesh of vipers. Your back ached from the stone floor. Your arm ached where the bubo had been. Your head ached with the fever that was still there, still cycling through its tides. And you were one of the lucky ones. This was what the luckiest version of this experience looked like. You thought about the people who weren't in Ward B, who weren't in Ward A, who were in the section of the Lazzaretto that no one mentioned by name, a building further in, past the main complex, that the Pizzigamorti visited with different tools, different body language, different faces. The section for the ones who were not going to be in the 1 in 3. They were being cared for too, fed, monitored, tended by Caterina and the other nurses and Fra Benedetto and whatever physician could reach them. But the care had a different quality, less about making something happen, more about being present for whatever was happening. Fra Benedetto spent more time in that section than anywhere else. You thought, what kind of person does that? What kind of person spends 6 weeks, 7 weeks now? He had been here when you arrived, moving through wards of dying people, sitting with them, staying, going home only to sleep and coming back. What does that do to you? What does that make of you? Ser Matteo had a theory. Ser Matteo had a theory about everything. It was his method of coping. Some people need to be needed, he had said. The friar would have been nobody in the ordinary world. A monk in a small church saying mass to 12 old women. Here he is irreplaceable. You thought this was wrong. Or not wrong exactly. Not inaccurate, but insufficient. Like explaining a cathedral by describing the labour costs. Fra Benedetto was irreplaceable here. That was true. But irreplaceable was not why he was here. He was here because he had made a decision about what his life was going to mean, and the plague hospital was where that decision had led him. You lay in the theriac haze and thought, what is my life going to mean? It was an enormous question for a person who, 48 hours ago, had been primarily focused on whether he was going to be alive long enough to have a life at all. But the thought was there. The fever had stripped away the structure of yourself, and in the stripped-down space the question sat quietly, not demanding an answer immediately, just present. What are you going to do? When you leave here, if you leave here, When you go back to Venice and walk across the bridges you know with your bones and carry things up the stairs and count your soldi at the end of the day, what are you going to do with the person this place is making you? The soup improved. Not dramatically. This was still a plague hospital at stretched capacity in the middle of an epidemic, and the resources were what they were. But after the first week, the thin grain water was augmented by actual bread. Dense, dark, made from coarse flour that had seen better days, but bread. And occasionally, from somewhere in the Lazzaretto's provisioning system, a piece of salted fish that you consumed with the focused intensity of a person who has discovered that salted fish is, in fact, a luxury. Food in the Lazzaretto taught you things about food. You had spent 14 months in Venice working physical labour, eating the cheapest food available from the market stalls. Bread and polenta and occasionally a piece of meat that was more gristle than not, supplemented by whatever fruit was bruised enough to be sold for almost nothing at the end of market day. You had not thought much about this food. You ate it because your body required fuel. The transaction was simple. In the Lazzaretto, food became something else. The soup, even the thin, barely soup of the first week, was warmth entering your body. Sustenance, a small act of continuation. Each bowl received from Caterina's hands was a statement. You are still here, you are being fed, the process continues. You ate everything, even when the fever made the smell of the soup nauseating, which it did regularly, the fever working on your stomach as well as your head. Even when chewing felt like a project requiring more effort than available, you ate it. Fra Benedetto had said, the will to eat. You are applying your will, mechanically sometimes, without enthusiasm, but applying it. On the 14th day, you were able to sit up, fully sit up, cross-legged on the pallet, which moved the straw underneath you in a way that felt slightly cooler and dramatically different from lying in the same position for 2 weeks. You sat up and felt the blood rush in the specific way it does when you move a body that has been horizontal for a long time. Dizzy. The ward tilted. You held the position until the tilting stopped. Breathed carefully. The ward looked different from sitting up. You had been seeing it from the horizontal for 2 weeks. The ceiling, the upper halves of the windows, the faces of people above you. Now you could see the full length of it. The pallets, the people. Some of them, you realized, had been here longer than you. You could tell from the quality of their stillness, the particular way their bodies had accommodated the pallets, the different relationship they had with the floor and the walls. They were veterans of this place in the way that you were not yet. The young woman, you had thought of her always as the young woman not knowing her name, had opened her eyes at some point in the last few days. She lay on her side and watched the ward with a calm that seemed to have cost her something. Occasionally she watched you back. You nodded. She did not nod, but her expression changed slightly. Ser Matteo was sitting up too, had been sitting up for 2 days, a development he reported with measured satisfaction. The doctor thinks the crisis has passed, he said. For me. For me too? He didn't say, but you haven't gotten worse in 3 days, that's something. 3 days of not getting worse. In a place where the baseline was decline, 3 days of not getting worse was a kind of progress. On the 17th day, Caterina said, "You can go to the courtyard." She said it briskly, without ceremony, in the same tone she used to say, "Eat your soup," as if it were simply the next item in the progression of the Lazzaretto's protocol. But the effect on you was something she probably could not have measured. The courtyard. outside. Air that had not been circulated through 40 sick people's lungs for weeks. Light that was not filtered through oiled cloth. The sky. You stood up. This was more complex than it sounds. Standing after 17 days, primarily horizontal, required a negotiation between your body and gravity. Your legs had opinions about this arrangement. Your head expressed several concerns. You put one hand on the wall and waited for the dizziness to pass. It passed. You walked down the length of the ward, past the pallets, past the collective breathing of Ward B. Fewer of them now. The number had changed again since the night of the bells. Some had gotten worse and been moved further in. Some had gotten better and been moved toward the convalescent section. And you pushed open the door at the end of the ward. The light hit you. After 17 days in the diffuse underwater light of the ward, the August sun in the Lazzaretto courtyard was physical. It hit your skin and your closed eyes, and you had to stand in the doorway for a moment, just adjusting, learning what actual sunlight felt like again. The warmth of it pressed into your face and your forearms and the backs of your hands, which were paler than you had ever seen them, the veins visible under white skin, the knuckles slightly prominent from weight lost and work not done. When you could see properly, you looked. The courtyard was large and open and paved with stone worn smooth by how many years of feet you couldn't calculate. There were other patients here, other people in various stages of recovery, sitting on stone benches along the walls, or standing in small groups, or simply standing alone and looking at the same thing you were looking at. The sky. Blue. Specifically the blue that August sky achieves over the Venetian lagoon. A blue of such particular intensity that artists had been trying to capture it for centuries and had mostly succeeded only in proving that paint cannot quite be that blue. The sun was at a late morning angle. It hit the courtyard walls and bounced back in the warm Mediterranean way. You closed your eyes. The sun on your face felt like a specific, concrete mercy. You stood there, didn't move. Just let the sun press against your skin and breathed. Actually breathed, deep and full. The first deep breath you had taken in 17 days without the ward's air going into your lungs. The courtyard air was not clean. You were still on an island full of sick people. The air was still marked by the compound smell of the Lazzaretto, the vinegar and sulfur and sickness. But there was also the lagoon in it. Salt, distance, the particular mineral emptiness of open water. You breathed it all the way to the bottom, and then you walked to the southern wall of the courtyard. The Lazzaretto Vecchio sat in the lagoon between Venice and the Lido, the long barrier island that separated the lagoon from the Adriatic. From the southern wall of the courtyard, looking north, you could see across the water. You could see Venice. The city was maybe 1.5 miles away, close enough to see, far enough that details resolved into shapes into a skyline that you knew but were seeing now from the outside for the first time. The Campanile, the great bell tower of San Marco, taller than everything else, was the first thing you found. It rose above the roof line of the city in the specific way it always did, unmistakable, the reference point that sailors used to navigate, the point from which all distances in Venice were measured. You had seen it every day for 14 months from within the city looking up. Now you were looking across at it, across 1.5 miles of flat lagoon water. The church of San Giorgio Maggiore was closer, on its own small island. Palladio had just designed it, the construction still ongoing in 1576. and its white stone caught the morning light in a way that made it glow slightly against the darker buildings behind it. You could see the red rooftops, the campaniles of other churches punctuating the skyline at intervals. The vague mass of the Rialto, the old wooden bridge, the one they'd been arguing about rebuilding in stone for years, the argument that had been going on so long it had become civic background noise, the bridge that had stood in some form or another since the 9th century, the domes, the towers, the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of building on water. From here, from this distance, Venice looked beautiful. It looked serene. You stood at the wall of a plague hospital and looked at the most serene republic and felt something happening in your chest that you couldn't immediately identify. Not sadness exactly, not homesickness, though there was that too. Something more complex. The city was dying. You knew that. 50,000 people would die in this outbreak, though you didn't know that number yet. You knew only the bells and the barges and the steady procession of bodies that arrived at this island every day. Venice was bleeding out. The great machinery of trade and art and governance was misfiring, running on reduced capacity. Shops were closed. Ships weren't sailing. Rumour of the Doge's illness had reached even the Lazzaretto, where news arrived via the workers who went back and forth between the island and the city. From here, you couldn't see any of that. From here, Venice looked the same as it always did. You thought about this, about the gap between how things look and what they are, about the serenity of the Serenissima. Venice presented itself to the world as composed, magnificent, functional. It had been presenting itself this way for 1,000 years, while underneath the presentation all the ordinary human chaos went on. The dying, the poverty, the corruption, the negotiations, the small cruelties and the small kindnesses. The plague had not changed Venice's presentation. The city looked the same from outside. You looked different, though. 17 days in this place had changed the person looking. You were thinner. You could feel it in the way your clothes hung. Your face felt angular in a way it hadn't before. Your hands, when you held them up in front of you, were paler and slightly trembling from the effort of being upright. But you were upright. You were standing, on your own legs, in the sun. Ser Matteo appeared beside you. He moved slowly, carefully, like a man learning to trust his own body again. He reached the wall and looked out at the same view. "There it is," he said. "Yes. My house is..." He oriented himself by the campanile, by the shape of the skyline. "Over there, somewhere in Cannaregio. I can't quite see it." "I lived in Castello," you said, "near the arsenal." "The arsenal's still going. I heard the workers have been continuing through the plague. The Republic needs its ships. Even here, even now, Venice was building its ships. You stood with Ser Matteo and looked at the city across the water. Around you, in the courtyard, other patients were doing the same thing, some quietly, some weeping, though they were trying not to show it. Some with the particular stillness of people looking at something they're not sure they'll see again. Nobody spoke very much. What was there to say? The city was there. You were here. The lagoon lay between, flat and patient and indifferent to either. A gull landed on the wall a few feet away from you and regarded you with its flat bird eye, and then launched itself back into the air with a casual authority that seemed almost contemptuous. The gull went where it wanted. The gull had no business with plague islands or quarantine or the mathematics of survival. "When we get back," Ser Matteo said. Not if, when. He had made his choice at some point. When, you didn't know, but it was made. "When we get back," you agreed. Ser Matteo exhaled, a long breath that held the shape of several weeks inside it. "I'm going to find out where my daughters are," he said, "whatever it costs." You said nothing. It wasn't a conversation you were meant to enter. He was talking to himself, or to the city across the water. "And you?" he asked. You looked at Venice, at the campanile, at the red roofs and the white facades and the towers. "I'm going to keep working," you said. It sounded small. Working is not small. "No, my whole business is people working. 20 years of people carrying things, making things, sewing things, loading things. If everyone in Venice decides to stop working," he gestured, "all of this disappears. The palaces and the art and the trade routes. It all runs on people carrying things." He looked at you. "Don't let anyone tell you carrying things is not important." You looked back at Venice, at the campanile rising above it all. "I was going to become a glass blower," you said. "Before Venice, I had it arranged. An uncle who knew a man in Murano. But the arrangement fell through, and then my uncle's cousin's contact turned out to be dead, and you became a porter instead. And I became a porter instead." Would you rather have been a glass blower? You thought about it. About the hot interior of a Murano glass house, the furnaces that burned day and night, the long metal blowpipes, the impossible skill of turning molten glass into something beautiful with just the force of your breath and the movement of your hands. "I still might be," you said. Ser Matteo made a sound, almost a laugh. "From a plague hospital to a glass house. Why not? Why not indeed?" The sun moved. The shadows in the courtyard shifted. From somewhere in the complex a bell rang. Not the death bell, a different one. The mealtime bell, announcing that the midday soup was ready. You turned away from the wall, but before you went in you looked at Venice one more time. The campanile, the roofs, the shimmer of water between here and there. You were going to get back to it. That was the thought that sat in you after the courtyard, solid and warm and separate from the fever, which was still there, still cycling, still tiding, but lighter than before. The thought that had survived the night of the bells and the bloodletting and the lancing and the grey early mornings in the ward. The thought that was going to carry you through the next few days and the next few weeks until the Lazzaretto was done with you. You were going back. There are things you don't think about when you're in the middle of surviving. Things you set aside as non-urgent, which is the correct decision. When your body is fighting for its continued existence, questions of meaning and consequence are legitimately lower priority. But in the third week, when the fever began its real recession, not the temporary reprieve of the previous weeks, but the longer withdrawal, the fever genuinely stepping back and leaving your body's own temperature, the things you had set aside began to return. What had happened to your things, your 2 shirts, your boots that Silvio had taken, the rosary, the wooden saint from your mother, the few sold you had in the room when the sanitar men came, taken by Benedetto Zorzi almost certainly, your landlord who never missed an opportunity. You'd arrived in Venice with nothing substantial and lived for 14 months on almost nothing. You had accumulated almost nothing, and yet those particular nothings, the carved saint, the rosary, those had weight. Fra Benedetto helped you write a letter. He had paper and ink which he produced from the small bag he always carried, and he sat beside you on the pallet in the grey morning light and wrote as you dictated. You wrote to your mother. You told her that you had been sick but were getting better. You told her you were in the Lazzaretto Vecchio, which you described carefully so that she wouldn't have to imagine it worse than it was. You told her about Fra Benedetto because you thought she would find that useful. She was a practical woman with a deep Catholic faith, and the fact of a friar present was something she could hold. You told her you were coming back, not home. You didn't have plans to return to Treviso, not yet, not while Venice still needed porters and still had glass houses in Murano that might need workers, but back to being alive, which was the thing she'd been most concerned about since before you left. Fra Benedetto sealed the letter with wax from a candle stub. Will it reach her? The post still moves, he said, more slowly than before, but it moves. He was here for 7 weeks now. He had not gotten sick. He moved through the ward as he always had, kneeling by the pallets, placing his hand on shoulders, speaking quietly. He had said Mass twice in the small chapel off the courtyard, which you had not attended. You could not walk that far yet, but which Caterina had described in terms that suggested it was not a comfortable Mass, not the kind where you sit in the pew and pass the time, the kind where something actually happens. He did not talk about being tired, but you could see it. In the way he moved toward the end of the day, slightly slower, the pauses between pallets slightly longer, in the way he sat down when he came to your pallet rather than crouching, because kneeling had become too much to ask of his joints. In the colour under his eyes that had not been there in the first week. 7 weeks of this. 7 weeks of the smell and the sounds and the decisions and the losses. When this is over, you said to him one morning, what do you do? Over is not a word I expect to apply to this work soon, he said. When the epidemic ends, when the Lazzaretto empties. Go back to my parish, say Mass for the parishioners who are still there. Try to... He stopped. Try to be the kind of priest I was trying to be before all this. Better than before, I hope. Can you be the same person after this? He looked at you. No, but that's true of everyone who comes through here. You won't be the same person either. How will I be different? He thought about it seriously, the way he took everything seriously. You'll know what matters, he said. You won't be able to pretend you don't know the way most people can pretend. You'll have had the pretense burned away. Is that good? It's useful, he said. Whether it's comfortable is a different question. Let me tell you something about the scale of what Venice was facing in 1576. In the census of 1563, the most recent count before the epidemic, Venice had a population of approximately 175,000 people. For a city sitting on 118 islands in a lagoon, that is an almost incomprehensible density. These people occupied every available space, every house, every room, every floor that could have a floor added above it. Venice had been growing upward for centuries because it couldn't grow outward, couldn't spread into the lagoon, couldn't push into the countryside the way mainland cities could. 175,000 people on islands connected by 400 bridges, and in the plague of 1576 to 1577, the epidemic sometimes called the Plague of Titian, because the greatest painter Venice ever produced died of it in August of 1576, the same month you arrived at the Lazzaretto. Approximately 46,000 of those people would die. 46,000 out of 175,000. That's more than a quarter of the city, gone in a little over a year. Think about what that means in terms of the sound of the city. The number of people walking over the Rialto Bridge on any given morning, the number of boats on the Canal Grande, the number of voices in any given campo, any given market, any given church. more than a quarter of those voices silenced. The plague showed no preference for neighbourhoods, though the poorer areas, where the density was highest, where the wells were nearest to the canals, where the rats moved freely, were hit harder. It showed limited preference for age, taking children and the elderly at higher rates but not sparing the young entirely, and it showed no preference whatsoever for fame or rank. The Doge Alvise Mocenigo died of it, the head of state of the most powerful republic in the Mediterranean. The great Titian, 99 years old and apparently still painting, died of it. Merchants, priests, painters, servants, porters, fishwives, gondoliers. Venice did not run from this. That is important. The city did not abandon itself. The health board continued to function. The barges continued to run. The Lazzaretto continued to receive the sick and do what it could. Many people fled the city. This is true, and the health board tried to stop them, and failed, and the plague followed the fleeing anyway. But the institutions held. The Lazzaretto Vecchio was not, by the standards of the time, a bad plague hospital. By the standards of modern medicine, it was a chamber of horrors, where the treatments were useless at best and occasionally harmful, where the conditions were such that secondary infections competed with the plague to kill patients, where approximately 2 of every 3 people who arrived did not leave alive. But it was something. It was a system. It was 150 years of accumulated knowledge about how to do this specific terrible task. The nurses who worked there, like Caterina, had done this before. The physicians, even the ones with their beak masks and their bloodletting lancets, were applying the best understanding available to them. They were wrong about almost everything. The miasma theory, bad air causing plague, meant they kept the windows closed and burned sulfur, when what might have actually helped was opening the windows and reducing the rat population. The bloodletting weakened patients who needed their strength. The lancing of buboes was actually one of the things that sometimes helped, not for the reasons they thought, not because it released humours, but because it could reduce the bacterial load in the body if the infection was primarily in the bubo rather than systemic. They were wrong about almost everything, and they kept showing up anyway. Caterina, who'd been working in the Lazzaretto for 11 years, who had lost her first husband to the plague of 1556, who moved through the ward with a competence born of practicing the wrong medicine long enough to develop instincts that occasionally transcended it. She kept showing up. Fra Benedetto, who knew he was probably going to die here eventually, because you could not spend this much time with this much plague without eventually losing, he kept showing up. That was worth knowing. That was worth carrying out of this place when you left. On the 23rd day, Dr. Marcello examined you and told you that you would be moved to the convalescent section within the week. The convalescent section. The meaning of this, you were going to survive. He said it without ceremony. He looked at your bubo, now a flattening scar, and at your eyes, and he took your pulse with his fingers on your wrist and asked you to stand and walk 3 steps and stand again, and he watched your legs while you did this. Convalescence, he said to Caterina, and he moved to the next pallet. That was it. The verdict, delivered in one word. You were going to be a convalescent. The word felt enormous. It had architecture. Beginning, middle, implied end. The convalescent is someone in the process of something, not sick, not well. In between, in the movement between, in the passage through. You were going to pass through. Ser Matteo was already in the convalescent section by then, had been moved 4 days earlier. He had come to the door of Ward B that evening to give you the news. and you had nodded and felt something difficult and clean at the same time, happy for him, and afraid that happiness was presumptuous. Now it was not presumptuous. You sat on your pallet in Ward B and looked at the ward that had been your world for 23 days. The ceiling with its crack and its stubborn pale plant, the high windows, the stone floor, cold and patient, the pallets that had held you and had held others and would hold others after you. Katerina was moving down the row. She had a basin and a cloth, and she was doing what she did every morning, checking temperatures, checking wounds, checking the basic status of each body. She got to you, looked at your arm, the scar, the healed skin, pinker than the surrounding area, slightly shiny. "Convalescence tomorrow," she said. "I know." She was turning away when you said, "Thank you." She stopped, turned back. Her expression was difficult to read. She had spent years developing a professional neutrality that served her well in this place, and it was deep set. But something in it shifted. "Do what the doctor says," she said. "Rest. Keep eating. Don't do anything stupid when they let you back in the city." It was not a sentimental speech, but it was, you understood, what she had in place of sentiment. "I won't," you said. She nodded and moved on. The convalescent building was lighter, more windows, set lower, actual glass in some of them rather than oiled cloth. You could see out, not well, not clearly. The Venetian glass distorted things, but you could see the courtyard, the light, the rough shapes of the other buildings. Ser Matteo was sitting on a proper stool by his bed, an actual bed raised off the floor when you arrived. He looked up from the piece of bread he was eating and made the minimal nod of a man who has chosen not to make a fuss of things. "About time," he said. "They kept me waiting." He offered you a piece of the bread. You took it. It was better bread than Ward B bread. Denser, slightly less stale, as if whoever provisioned the Lazzaretto had opinions about the bread for survivors versus the bread for the uncertain. Fra Benedetto appeared the following morning, as he appeared everywhere at first light. He stood in the doorway of the convalescent room and looked at you across the space, with a specific look of someone who has spent weeks watching a situation develop and is now seeing its resolution. "Well," he said. "Well," you said. He sat down. You talked for an hour. Really talked. The first actual sustained conversation since your arrival. Neither of you navigating pain or fever or the compressed language of urgent need. You talked about Treviso, about the village and the farmland and the Sile River in winter. He talked about Padua, where he had studied, the library there, the specific pleasure of reading in a cold room with one good lamp. You talked about Venice, the way it absorbed everything, every person who came to it with something to prove, every merchant, every painter, every young man from the mainland with a letter of introduction, and 2 shirts, and a stubborn kind of hope. "It's still the most beautiful city in the world," you said, "even now." "Especially now," Fra Benedetto said. "Things that are dying are always most themselves." You looked at him. "Is it dying? Venice? Truly dying?" He thought about it. "The epidemic will end. They always end. The city will rebuild. The population, the trade, the life of it. Venice is an idea as much as a place, and ideas are harder to kill than people." He paused. "But 50,000 people is not an abstraction. 50,000 is, it will leave marks. Everything leaves marks." "Yes." He looked at you with something in his eyes that was not quite a smile, but held the shape of one. "That's exactly right." They released you from the Lazzaretto Vecchio on September 12th, 1576, 40 days. That was the quarantine period for convalescents, 40 days total in the Lazzaretto system, between the acute illness and the recovery period. The word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40. Venice invented quarantine, invented the practice, invented the word. 150 years of trying to stop the plague from spreading had produced this number. 40 days, and then you can go. There were 6 of you on the barge back to the city. 6 survivors heading home. The barge was a different boat than the one that had brought you. Newer, cleaner, still smelling of the vinegar they washed everything with, but without the particular odour of the incoming barge. Or maybe it was the same boat, and you were simply smelling different things now. Ser Matteo sat beside you. He had written to his daughters, letters through Fra Benedetto's postal arrangements, and had received one reply in his younger daughter's handwriting, which he had read and reread until the paper was soft at the folds. He held it in his coat pocket now, his right hand occasionally touching the outside of his coat over the place where the letter was. The young woman who had watched you from across the ward, you had finally learned her name, Fiammetta, a dyer's apprentice from Murano, sat at the front of the barge and watched the city approach with an expression you could not read. The others were strangers, but all of you were strangers who had breathed the same air for weeks, who had watched the same windows go from dark to grey to light and back again, who had heard the same bells. You all watched Venice come toward you. The campanile first, as always, the bell tower rising above everything, steady, permanent, having survived fires and earthquakes and plagues and centuries of water eating at its foundations. Then the details, the domes, the rooftops, the boats on the Canal Grande, the activity of a city that was diminished but not stopped, the bells ringing, the ordinary bells, the hours, not the death knell, the sound of commerce and prayer and argument and the 10,000 small negotiations that kept a city alive. The barge pulled up to a fondamenta. A health official was waiting with his ledger. He checked your names, made his notes. "Released," he said to each of you in turn. "You are released." And that was it. You stepped off the barge onto a stone fondamenta in Venice, and the stone was solid under your feet in the way that stone in Venice is never quite solid, always slightly uncertain, always slightly floating. And you stood there for a moment. The city was around you, the smell of it, canal and coal and cooking, and the particular human density of 500 people living in close proximity on every street. Different from the Lazzaretto's smell, complex in a different way. Not the smell of illness and loss, but the smell of life in all its untidy persistence. Ser Matteo touched your arm briefly. "Good luck, Giacomo. Good luck." He walked off toward Cannaregio, toward wherever his daughters were. You stood on the fondamenta alone and looked at Venice. It was mid-September. The light had changed from August. Cooler, more golden. The particular angle of autumn light that Venice does better than anywhere else. The low sun hit the facades of the buildings along the canal and turned them amber and ochre and the particular shade of aging stucco that is simultaneously decay and beauty. Your boots were still with Silvio, presumably. Your shirts were probably gone. Your soldi were certainly gone. You had the clothes you were wearing, a letter your mother had written back. It had arrived at the Lazzaretto 3 weeks after you sent yours, and Fra Benedetto had brought it to the convalescent ward with the specific care of someone delivering something important, and a carved wooden saint that Caterina had pressed into your hands on your last morning saying only, "Someone left it, someone who didn't need it anymore." You put the saint in your pocket, you took a breath of Venice, air, and you started walking. The first bridge you crossed felt different. Not because the bridge was different. It was one of the ordinary stone bridges, 2 steps up, 2 steps down, the worn stone smooth in the middle where 1,000 years of feet had polished it, that you had crossed dozens of times a day for 14 months without thinking about it. But crossing it now, you felt every step, the cold of the stone through your boots, the slight roughness of the balustrade under your hand, the movement of the water below, dark green in the September light, moving in the slow, complex way of canal water that is responding to tides and boat wash and wind from the lagoon. All of it present. You had been walking through this city for 14 months with the particular inattention of someone going somewhere, focused on the destination, the crate, the bale, the sack of grain, the weight on your back and the distance to cover, Venice as backdrop to the task. Now there was no task. There was just Venice, and Venice was stone and water and light and the smell of 1,000 years. Venice was the church on your left with the dark interior visible through the open door, the priest moving inside doing whatever priests do in the mid-morning on an unremarkable Tuesday. Venice was the woman hanging laundry from a window 3 floors up, the white shirts drying in the September air. Venice was the cat on the doorstep regarding you with the specific authority of a cat who has decided this doorstep belongs to it. Venice was the small boy running across the bridge ahead of you, running for no reason, running because he was small and his legs worked and running was possible. You stood on the far side of the bridge and watched him run. You had been in the Lazzaretto for 40 days. In those 40 days, approximately 3,000 people had died in Venice from the plague. The numbers would continue. The epidemic was not over. It would continue through the winter, through the following spring, eventually petering out as these things always do, starved of new fuel. The Lazzaretto Vecchio would continue to receive barges for months. But you were here. The boy was running. The cat was on the doorstep. The woman's laundry was drying in the September light. This was life in Venice. Rough and crowded and smelling of canal and not especially kind to the poor, in all the specific ways that the poor had always known about while the rich were discovering whether the same was true for them. Life with all the machinery of it exposed, the work and the carrying and the negotiating and the daily arithmetic of survival. Worth it. Something had happened to you in the Lazzaretto. Fra Benedetto had said the pretense would be burned away. He was right as far as it went. But what had replaced the pretense was not despair and not wisdom exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than either. Attention. The ability to be here, specifically here, this bridge, this water, this light, without rushing past it towards somewhere else. The ability Fra Benedetto had shown you by example, sitting beside one person at a time, fully present, not managing them from a distance. You had been given 40 days to learn how to pay attention. The question was what to pay attention to next. You found Silvio at the Rialto at midday. He was carrying a crate on his back, the same work, the same route, the same grunt of effort as he took the steps up the bridge, and he almost walked past you before he recognized you. He stopped. The crate was heavy. He was sweating in the September sun, his face the specific red of a man in the middle of physical exertion. He looked at you for a moment. Then, "You're alive." "I'm alive." He shifted the crate. Give me a minute to put this down. He put the crate down at the far side of the bridge, where he was meant to deliver it, and the recipient received it with the brisk nod of someone who's been waiting and considers waiting an imposition. Silvio came back to you. "Your boots," he said. "Yes." He looked at your feet. "I kept them. I actually kept them." "I heard you say you would." "I know, but—" He made a gesture. "A lot of people said they'd keep things, for people who went to the Lazzaretto, and then they didn't, because usually the people didn't come back." "Yes." He looked at you with something in his face that you couldn't quite name. Guilt, maybe, relief, the complicated expression of someone who had expected to feel one thing and is finding himself feeling several things at once. "I'll get you the boots," he said. "Not now, tonight, maybe. Buy me a cup of wine first." He laughed. A short, startled sound. "A cup of wine? You've been in the plague hospital for 6 weeks and you want wine." "I've wanted wine for 6 weeks. I want it now." He bought you wine at a tavern near the Rialto. Ordinary wine, slightly acid, the kind you drunk hundreds of times before. Nothing special. You drank it in the narrow shade of the building's overhang and watched the market, the movement of people and goods and the perpetual commerce of Venice, and you felt it go down warm into your stomach. Silvio told you what had happened in the city while you were gone, who had died, names you knew, names that landed with the particular weight of specific absences. The painter Titian, which surprised no one since he was 99 years old, and it was remarkable he had survived this long. A woman at the market who had sold you polenta for 14 months, and whose name you suddenly could not remember, and were disturbed by your failure to remember. 2 of the other porters from the Rialto crew. He told you the Doge was dead, that the new Doge was Sebastiano Venier, the man who had commanded the fleet at Lepanto 5 years earlier, the great naval victory over the Ottomans, the battle that Venice still talked about in the tone of a city reassuring itself of its continued relevance. New leadership, same city. You told Silvio about the Lazzaretto. Not everything. You didn't have words for everything yet, maybe never would. But something. Fra Benedetto, Ser Matteo, Caterina with her flat eyes, and her competence and her precise hands, the smell, the night of the bells. He listened. He didn't say much. He drank his wine and listened. When you were done, he was quiet for a moment. "You're going back to carrying?" he asked. "For now, while I find something else." "What else?" You thought about the glass houses of Murano, about the way Fiammetta had stood on the barge watching Venice approach, her hands held slightly away from her sides, like someone trying not to grip too tight. "I don't know yet," you said, "but something." Silvio refilled your cup. "Well," he said, "the crates aren't getting any lighter." "No, and there's always work. There's always work." You drank the wine. Venice recovered. Not quickly, and not completely. 50,000 dead left a specific kind of emptiness that took a generation to fill. Houses that stayed empty for years. Trades that shrank and took decades to grow back. A city that was slightly quieter than it had been, slightly less dense, slightly more aware of its own fragility. But it recovered. The Redentor, the great church that Palladio designed as a votive offering to God for delivering Venice from the plague, was begun in 1577, the year after the epidemic began to wane. Every year since, on the 3rd Sunday of July, Venice crosses a bridge of boats to the Redentor church to remember. Candles are floated on the water. Fireworks are set off. The lagoon fills with boats. It still happens. The bridge of boats, the church, the candles. Venice still remembers. The Lazzaretto Vecchio continued operating as a plague hospital until the 1700s. The island then passed through various uses: military storage, quarantine for animals, and eventually became an archaeological site. In excavations in the late 20th century, they found the mass graves, thousands of bodies, buried in waves, layer after layer, going back to the earliest plague epidemics. The bones of the people who arrived by barge and did not leave alive. They found, in one grave, the bodies of people who appeared to have been buried with small objects, personal items, a ring, a ceramic fragment, a small carved wooden figure. Someone had put these things with the dead, maybe a Caterina, maybe a Fra Benedetto. Someone who understood that the dead were not just bodies to process, not just numbers in a ledger. Someone who made sure each one had something beside them in the dark. That's worth knowing. Come back to the room where you are. You've been in Venice with me tonight, on the barge across the lagoon, in the ward with its stone floor and its 40 bodies breathing. In the courtyard looking back at the city across the water. You've been in 1576 with Caterina and Fra Benedetto and Ser Matteo, in a place that was trying to save people with the tools it had, which were inadequate and applied with love anyway. That's worth sitting with for a moment. The inadequate tools, applied with love anyway. Caterina washing the wound with vinegar, which worked imperfectly and was better than nothing, and was done precisely and without flinching every morning. Fra Benedetto sitting by the pallets without a mask, reading Augustine to people who were dying. Dr. Marcello in his wax-coated coat and his beak mask full of herbs, doing his rounds in a building where more than half the people would die, because the rounds still needed to be done. They didn't know about germ theory. They didn't know about bacteria or flea vectors, or how the plague actually moved from body to body. They were wrong about almost everything, and they showed up every day anyway. The Lazzaretto Vecchio stood on its small island in the Venetian lagoon for 350 years, and received the sick and did what it could. Not enough. Never enough. But something. Always something. You're somewhere warm right now, somewhere that smells of neither vinegar nor sulfur, somewhere that does not have 40 people breathing their fevers into the same enclosed space, somewhere you chose to be, or arrived at, or were carried to by the accumulation of whatever your days have been. You're not on a plague barge. You're not in a ward waiting to find out which third you belong to. You're here, in the present, in a room that is yours. Let that be the thing you hold tonight. The simple, unremarkable fact of being in a warm room in the present. Your body doing what bodies do. Breathing, circulating, maintaining the intricate biological machinery of being alive. Without requiring your conscious attention, your body is doing that, right now. While you lie still, while your eyes close, while you let the day go. The 40 days are over. You're on the other side. The sounds around you, whatever they are, whatever your nighttime world offers, let them be part of this. Not intrusions, not interruptions, just the texture of the present. A city somewhere in the distance, or no city, just house sounds, just the small mechanics of a structure at rest. Let the sounds be there and let them not matter. Let your breathing slow, not the careful, precise breathing of someone managing pain, not the shallow breath of fever, not the monitored inhalation of a person sharing bad air with 40 others, just your breathing, ordinary and complete, in and down and out, in the way that breathing goes when the body is safe and the mind is beginning to let go. Somewhere across the Venetian lagoon, The Lazzaretto Vecchio sits on its small island. It is quiet now, has been quiet for centuries. The walls are old, and some of them have fallen, and the archaeologists come in summer to catalogue the layers. The lagoon water moves around it in the same patient way it always has. The bones in the graves are still there, thousands of them, layer after layer. The people who arrived by barge and stayed. And underneath the bones, if you went deep enough, the packed lagoon mud that Venice has always stood on. The ancient bottom of a sea that retreated and left this shallow, warm water behind. And on the water the islands formed, and on the islands Venice grew. The same mud that holds the foundations of the palaces, the same mud that the 1,000-year-old pilings are driven into. The same mud under the Campanile, under San Marco, under the Rialto Bridge. The whole city floating on the same ancient seafloor. That doesn't change. People come and go. 50,000 in a plague year, 100,000 in a generation, millions across the centuries. They come and they carry things and they negotiate and they build and they make art and they die in plague hospitals and they recover and they walk back across the bridges and they grow old. The mud stays. The lagoon stays. The blue of the August sky that is too blue for any painter to quite capture, that stays. These are things that will be there after you and after me and after everyone listening to this. Not as comfort exactly, but as context. You are part of a very long story, and tonight, in this moment, you are warm enough. Warm enough. That's the thing. Not comfortable in every dimension, not solved, not without the ordinary accumulation of what your particular life contains, but warm enough, fed enough, safe enough, in a bed that is yours, with blankets that smell of your life and not of vinegar, with the particular darkness of your room around you, and whatever silence or sound your night contains. Warm enough, safe enough, resting enough. Let it be enough. Let your body settle into the mattress, the actual mattress, not the 6 inches of straw between you and the stone floor of a plague hospital. The mattress that holds you and presses back in the way that properly supported rest feels. Let the weight of you go into it. Let your hands rest. Your hands that have held things today, pen or phone or door handle or whatever your hands hold, let them open. Let the shoulders fall. Let the jaw unclench. Let the thoughts that are still moving, and there are always thoughts still moving at this hour, the brain's last inventory, the day's unfinished business being filed and released. Let them move and let them go. You don't need to finish them tonight. Tomorrow will take them. The stars above the Venetian lagoon tonight, if you could see them, if the lights went off and the clouds cleared, are the same stars that were above the Lazzaretto Vecchio in August of 1576. The same stars Fra Benedetto saw when he walked from the convalescent ward to his small room. The same stars Caterina walked under on the night she was allowed to go home. The same stars Giacomo Beltrame saw through the port of the barge, lying on his side, watching the lagoon at night on the way to the island. The same stars. 500 years is not so long in the language of stars. The same light reaching you. Everything that happened is still somewhere. All the bells that rang. All the vinegar on all the walls. All the soup in all the wooden bowls. All the conversations in the convalescent ward about what would happen when the 40 days were over. Still somewhere. And you, here, tonight, on the other side of all of it, on the other side of everything that had to be survived to get you here. Let the dark come. Let the sounds of your world go quiet, or let them continue. They don't require your attention anymore. Let your breathing take over, slow and steady and automatic, the way it has been since the day you were born, the way it will be through the whole long night until morning, in and out, the rhythm of it, the small, steady persistence of it. This is what carried you to morning in every difficult night you have ever lived through. This will carry you tonight. Tomorrow there will be work. Tomorrow there will be noise and bridges and decisions and the ordinary weight of a life being lived. Tomorrow there will be all of it. But that's tomorrow. Right now, there's just this. The softness of sleep reaching up to claim you. The quiet of the room. The distant heartbeat of a city that never quite stops. Or a silence that holds its own kind of peace, depending on where you are. Let your thoughts slow. Let them soften. Let them finally stop. You've been to the Lazzaretto Vecchio tonight. You've seen what 40 days looks like and what it makes of a person. You've sat beside Fra Benedetto while he read Augustine in the half-light. You've eaten Caterina's soup, all of it, because someone told you to, and you had decided to keep going. You've looked at Venice from across the water and seen it whole. The city was there. It's still there, and you are still here. Centuries will pass. The ward you lay in will become rubble, and then archaeology, and then memory. The stone floor will crack. The crack in the vault will widen until the vault itself is gone. The straw pallets will rot back into earth. But somewhere in all that time, people will still lie down at the end of a difficult day and breathe carefully and wait for morning. Some things don't change. The need for rest doesn't change. The particular mercy of darkness after a long day, that doesn't change either. So let it come. Let sleep take you the way it took Giacomo Beltram in his convalescent bed in September of 1576, 40 days after the barge brought him to the island. Let the world fade. Let the noise quiet. Let your thoughts slow and soften and finally stop. You've earned this. Take it. Good night.